Grand Rapids Medical Mile continues to grow with investments topping $1 billion in recent years. An impact survey reveals the expansion is impacting infrastructure and housing demands. We address those impacts and solutions on West Michigan Week. And thank you for joining us on West Michigan Week. On our panel, Chris Knapp, Grand Rapids Press. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Kara Valade, Grand Rapids Business Journal. Cheers. And our guest today, we have Suzanne Schultz, here, the Planning Director with the City of Grand Rapids, and Paul Spolstra, he's the President of the Medical Mile Resource Group. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, big news this week on a project that has just exploded in the last decade, and that is the Medical Mile. I think that's now the official name, Healthcare Hill for other people. The survey comes out, or is out now. Give some of those bullet points for the viewer of what is shaping up and where we're heading.
We're just starting the initial phases of doing a whole corridor plan for Michigan Street. And part of, there's a number of components to it. It actually extends down to Wealthy to include St. Mary's campus. And we're looking at the anchor institutions, being the eds and meds that we know between Grand Rapids Community College and GVSU and BAI and Spectrum and St. Mary's. And trying to understand what economic impact they have on the community and the surrounding neighborhoods, and how we can facilitate future development along, especially Michigan Street, because we have some infrastructure concerns, particularly related to transportation. So we've been undertaking a number of studies to understand kind of what the baseline is of existing conditions, and going forward we'll be looking for public input and ideas about how the future should, what the future should look like along the corridor.
What was the traffic report? Anybody trying to get up the hill or back down the hill during drive time is probably counting cars, but wasn't it like 50,000?
During, yeah, when 196 was closed, we had 40 to 50,000 cars that were on Michigan Street, and that kind of gave us a glimpse of the future about what we could expect. And as anybody who sat at Michigan and College intersection knows, the wait time keeps getting longer and longer. And when you think about it, you've got two emergency rooms right off that street, and people have got to be able to move.
So traffic diversion may be a piece of the ultimate plan.
It could be. The challenge is that there's so many neighborhoods that directly abut the institutions and along that corridor. And how do you balance making sure there's the mobility of the roadway on Michigan Street and there's access without having people always going into the neighborhoods and causing traffic impacts and parking issues for the neighborhoods that surround the area?
Any recommendations coming to mind at this point? I understand the frustration. We've seen that for a long period of time, even before the build-out from Spectrum, before Van Andel Institute, as little institutions, service sector businesses were being, properties were being bought and those stores were closing, convenience places for neighborhoods. So it's a little like having a manufacturing community built up around a commercial or a residential neighborhood. So those impacts are how do you fix it after it's already done? Well,
I think that's the question, and one of the reasons we're doing this study is to try to understand the competing interests that we have up there. We have major institutions that are regional employers. Spectrum Health is the largest employer in the city of Grand Rapids. So we want to make sure that they're successful and that they can continue to grow. At the same time, we have a federally recognized historic district to the south. We have pretty intact neighborhoods. We have 196, which is a major barrier as far as thinking about how a whole transportation network works and where growth can go. So we're trying to figure out this kind of development potential and making sure there's enough capacity for future growth of the institutions and neighborhood quality of life. When residents have seen those neighborhood services be lost as the institutions have been buying land, and they're feeling the traffic impacts of 1.25 million visitors a year coming to the corridor. And how do you kind of manage through all of those and understand that? We're looking at some potential solutions. The Rapids BRT, Bus Rapid Transit route, will actually extend up to Michigan Street, and there's a station by Van Andel Institute and through Grand Rapids Community College campus. So really you start looking at maybe you shift modes. You look at transit as another option. You look at maybe having people live in the neighborhoods that they can walk instead of drive. and then they could support some of the neighborhood services. So that's kind of the long view, is how do you kind of manage through that?
Is there, I would think, more discussion on the commercial application process and what that's doing to create new businesses and industry, and especially along that corridor? Is there room, Paul, or do you see that happening farther down the hill, closer to St. Mary's, and growing out from the Medical Mile?
Well, thank you. One reason our group, Medical Mile Research Group, is excited about the survey is because they're looking at the 4-mile wide impact of the Medical Mile. Even as we first started our group, we were struggling with everybody asking us what's happening with the 1 mile of Michigan Street. But it is a much broader impact, and to see, like, for instance, Riley Hardware realizing they need to build and expand for the neighborhood, but yet find a way that they can still stay close to their constituents as they grow. But then that facility, what can be used in the Medical Mile to expand.
It seems like we've had some success in that realm already with examples like Riley. Walgreens wanted to expand. They worked with the city. They found that spot where D&W, I think, was going to go originally. Yeah. And they've built a large new store there. But so what are the challenges then that we're still looking at, and when we see what look like they may be successes, I guess, in a lot of people's minds in terms of maintaining neighborhood services there? What are some of the problems that you're seeing out there in terms of that?
I think the corner of Michigan and Lafayette's a good example. When you look, there used to be a bank, there used to be a pharmacy and restaurant and little party store that served the neighborhood. Those have been lost as the institutions are looking to acquire more land for future growth. And is there a way that they can incorporate some of those neighborhood services into their facilities? If you have to have a pharmacy in the hospital that's serving everybody there, could the pharmacy be at the street instead of inside the building? Is there a different way to develop so then you're providing neighborhood services? One of my favorite examples is on Lafayette, further down by St. Mary's, between Cherry and Wealthy. There's actually a pharmacy, a coffee shop, a gift shop, and when you go down that street, you'd never know it. And so how do you kind of reframe what we think of, internal services to serve the hospitals or the community college or whoever it might be, and kind of reframe it in a way that also serves the neighborhood, which in some cases it can be a win-win-win, where the institutions benefit because they don't have to subsidize the coffee shop anymore. The neighborhood benefits because they have some vitality going on and they have a service in their neighborhood. And even visitors can benefit because now they're seeing people on the street, they have a greater sense of security and safety. And so it kind of all starts to build together when we look at how do we create community and that sense of a future.
What is the density there when we take a look at population? Give me a sense of how many acres and how many people live within so many square miles.
There's, if you look at just kind of that core area, it's actually 1 square mile with St. Mary's up to the freeway. Within that area, we've got about 50,000 employees and students, 50 acres. Very, very small area up on the hill. 50,000 people that are there daily working or going to school. And then on top of that, for the entire corridor area, we have about 20,000 people who live there. So it's a village unto itself, really, when you look at that kind of population density. And only 3.5% of the employees who work for the institutions live in the neighborhoods. So there's a lot of opportunity, not saying everybody should live in the neighborhood. The neighborhood can't handle that many people. But if you got that number up to 4%, what would that mean for new investment in the neighborhood? Can you fill some of the vacant houses that have been affected by foreclosures?
My understanding that there's been some demand for housing within that campus area. So that you're nodding, so true. That is true?
Yeah, yeah. We actually, part of our data collection efforts in this beginning phase is we hired U3 Ventures, which is out of West Philadelphia, and they've dealt with the campus there. They're working in Detroit, in Midtown Detroit, and they worked with the institutions to understand their data for the students and employees. We also have been working with Lori Volk of Zimmerman Volk Associates, who's a national housing expert. And Lori looked at the demographics and the housing preferences and really found there's a big demand for new housing products, mostly multifamily rentals. That's really where the market is. Over a third of the people who are now moving into the neighborhoods aren't from Grand Rapids, aren't from here. They're coming from other places in the country who are used to more urban environments, who don't necessarily want to buy a single-family home. They'd like to have a condo or an apartment instead. And she says that the younger generation has really become disillusioned with home ownership based on this huge loss in equity people have seen. Yeah, so that's really the trend is apartments and townhouses, and it's a different housing model than what we've seen in the past.
So are there any actual proposals on the table, or are you talking with developers actively to add some density and bring another tower downtown, or bring another development like the Park Row condominiums, which is there at the Midtown Village development near, College in Michigan?
Yep. We've had developers who have been interested over time, kind of expecting that, everybody looks at it and says, well, you've had $1 billion worth of development, there's got to be some sort of spillover effect. Yes. So we've, it's kind of, when does that happen? Because it really has been isolated. You look at the housing stock and the retail along the corridor, and nothing much, there's been changes like Riley's Ace Hardware, but nothing that you would think would match the kind of investment that's already happened with the institutions.
Well, that's a function somewhat of the real estate market, too. We had a lot of proposals that were kind of on the table at one time that really kind of tanked after the real estate market tanked, and now...
Financial institutions.
Well, a project like that can't get financed now.
And lending for residential is one of the most difficult things.
Right.
But we were hoping one of the reasons we did this study was that would help bolster a developer's kind of when they go to the bank and they have a study to back them, that it kind of provides that justification.
Are you also measuring income and education levels then as part of that survey? And are you seeing some bumps in that? Because Grand Rapids is even ranked lower in college attainment for the population than Detroit at this point. That's a pretty big piece of economic development by itself. So is that finally doing what people promised or thought it might in terms of those attainments?
Well, one thing that I wanted to mention is that this is an ongoing survey, and they have done very well at building community input, opportunities for community input, even adding a little fun to the survey, I hear. So I'm looking excited to learn more about the game. But it's a good point to know that there is a lot of different aspects of Grand Rapids that needs to get involved with the survey, from academics to real estate and to obviously the local businesses. And so being able to build off this survey and finding those needs. One of the findings that we found, one of our members, Mary Smith from Greenridge Relocation, is that many of the tours that she's providing, some folks are looking for maybe quality temporary housing so they can settle into their locations, into their jobs, but yet still wanting to keep an eye where they will ultimately be relocating to in the West Michigan area. So building those infrastructures to allow for that flexibility is also very important.
All right, we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, more on the discussion about the growth of the Medical Mile Corridor. And we're back discussing the expansion of the Medical Mile Corridor. And we were talking about some of those properties that are located nearby. We had mentioned Riley's Hardware Store and the importance of having those local retailers in the neighborhood. Riley's did move into a new property. Do they retain ownership of the old property? Are they leasing that?
They are leasing that.
Okay, so this is the big question. Everybody knows the value of these properties. How, as the expansion moves along, do those properties become available and not having some of these projects held hostage for a king's ransom, essentially?
Yeah, that's really going to be one of the questions. In fact, in the housing study, that was identified as a potential impediment for future supply, that you can't acquire the land and develop it at a reasonable price for, by that time you're done with land acquisition, you still have to do a project. So that's going to be a big issue, I think, in the future for us is, how many people are banking on making the money and selling it to somebody who can write that large check, and can those who can write the large check be able to inevitably afford it? Because of the lending markets or what their funding availability is. So it's going to be a challenge. The city has never, we don't use eminent domain unless we need it for an infrastructure project. Economic development, there's been a Supreme Court decision that said you can do it if you want to, but then there was a state measure that was passed by voters that said, well, if you do it, you have to follow all these rules. So it does have kind of this, there's a double-edged sword in there that's going to be, everybody has to navigate through.
Well, and I'm sure you've identified those properties that could potentially be a hang-up in some of these projects.
Yeah, we will be looking at ownership patterns as part of this. The road itself is a substantial issue. You look at the intersection in Michigan and College. We have a $1.6 million grant to do improvements to that intersection. Well, you can widen the road, and you have the cleaners that are right there at the sidewalk. You have Bagel Beanery at the other corner that has a drive-through, and their parking is right there where you would acquire. And so there's significant impacts if you look at property acquisition just for the transportation corridor. So it's going to be a challenge.
Account for helicopters in that sector too.
Yeah,
it makes kind of a difference, doesn't it, with landing pads on the hospital and at St. Mary's down the hill.
Yeah, how high the buildings can be.
Paul, there was another public hearing for the medical community, more specifically this week, and I'm wondering what kinds of concerns you heard from them or input for this.
I'm sorry, I was not aware of it, so
okay.
Can't speak to that.
That was a Thursday meeting, wasn't there? Wednesday
your group.
Thursday?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The networking group.
Okay.
For your networking group, have you been hearing from the members that they're concerned or they're interested, or?
Yes, they're very interested in the survey. Eric Eichfluck from Excel Engineering is asked to be very well connected with this survey and to be able to be a leader into that, mainly a lot to do with his experience in infrastructure and engineering. But our concern still is with Medical Mile is what is the regional impact of the Medical Mile, and how can small businesses, as an example, of course we're talking about buildings and facilities, but how can the business owners be brought in as partners to maybe let their property be expanded, but where can we move them to and work with them to provide a business plan to find the profitability to be able to relocate or to be actively involved in the developments.
Paul, I'm wondering, and Suzanne too, what responsibility do you think Spectrum Health, as a nonprofit community hospital, has to making sure that the neighborhood is developed in an appropriate way? I mean, they've created this monster, if you want to call it that. I mean, it's an economic engine, and they've, you drive up there and it's a little bit like driving into a canyon. It's not a very approachable canyon. It's not a real neighborhood-friendly canyon, but there's a lot of potential. They own a lot of land around it right now where these types of issues could be resolved, or they could expand and build another big building. So how do you work with Spectrum in a situation like this, and what responsibility do they have to making sure that what they do in the future is perhaps maybe a little bit more integrated in the neighborhood than it is now?
When we look at national examples, I mean, Cleveland Clinic has been very interested in how they grow. Philadelphia, again, they've been really looking at what's going to attract the best and the brightest. And if you're looking at attraction and retention of that creative workforce, your researchers, your professors, and what you want, that physical environment and how these institutions grow is really critical. And for Spectrum, they do own a lot of land. And I think they're going to be a very good partner. When they designed the Children's Hospital, there were a couple design decisions that had to be made on that, and how do you preserve the walkability of the neighborhood, at least at that one point. And Michigan Street's such a busy street, and the building placement can become critical. They've been pretty open to working with us and trying to understand the neighborhood. It's those softer things like how do you have an employee walk to work program and incentivize your employees to live in the neighborhoods? Again, how do you incorporate that pharmacy that you already were going to put in the inside of the building on the outside of the building? There's decisions from a facility side that will have to be made as they continue to grow, and that's really part of the discussion. Is are we looking for a mixed use environment which seems to attract that creative class? Or are we looking towards a single-use environment, which is predominantly what we've seen so far?
Do you feel like they're on board with that vision, though? And do you feel, from the small business standpoint, do you feel as though Spectrum is an entity, and St. Mary's to some extent, is an entity that's supportive of these kinds of initiatives? Or are you talking without them really being part of the conversation?
Well, I think they have been obviously need to be part of the conversation. But for instance, with the the Heritage Hill and the Heritage Hill Association, as she's speaking to, that there's a lot of different folks that are working in these facilities, and to be able to have that partnership to provide the housing and unique housing. There is people that are going to want to live in the Heritage Hill because of the historical nature that is there. Other people are going to want to commute. And if the neighborhoods go away from around the Medical Mile, that's just going to put a larger burden on parking, infrastructure, and traffic and things like that too. So.
And those neighborhoods are really assets. I mean, they can be as assets in the attraction of those workers. And so, how do you really
looking for the housing?
If they're looking
with
for that,
such big demand.
Yeah.
So is Spectrum at the table, though? I mean, are they?
Yes, they are contributing to the study, and they are on the steering committee. There is a difference, kind of. St. Mary's has a master plan for their campus, and they do have some parking lots right now that surround their buildings. They have envisioned kind of a mixed use. They are actually proposing on Jefferson, where they have lots right now, doing some sort of retail at the bottom and office above. So St. Mary's really, from their master planning standpoint, I think they've really looked at it from a campus standpoint by integrating it into the neighborhood. Spectrum, from buildings, they've been building much larger buildings, but I think they're at the table and they're willing to participate and be part of that dialogue. And it's just really the challenge is when you get into the cost of the land, again, their programmatic needs and how you kind of put those pieces together.
Isn't development jumping over the highway at this point?
There's been interest on jumping, Lafayette and Coit, both Coit and Hastings, which is right over we have the bridge overpass 196, and then Lafayette's the underpass at Lafayette and Hastings, and there was interest in acquiring a whole block to develop for Grand Valley State University.
So more education.
Yeah.
Is that the natural movement? Because I wanted to follow up with Chris's point and being familiar with the area and calling it a canyon, which I have before, and knowing that the space is so limited and so valuable, I think there is concern that every square inch is going to be used up as growth continues eastward, that you do need kind of a place to breathe along there, because those newer buildings, they're beautiful, by the way. You step inside and the services inside are world class. But I understand that concern. I mean, it is just so condensed in there. There needs to be a place to breathe.
And I think it's this tight balance, because the density is great to advance transit. I mean, if you have that density of employees for transit and retail, you have all those people who are now consumers that you could target. But the density, the development, we always look at building massing and scale and how it works with the street, and there's actually proportions. The street it's a good-sized street, but it's not huge when you look at, it's not 8 lanes, although the traffic could certainly, they'd like that room. But the buildings are very dense, and how do you do a public space on the street, or how do you make sure there's a wide enough sidewalk? Is this constant tension that we've got with the development projects, because our standard is 12 to 14 feet for sidewalk, and you're fighting when we get into putting a building there. Can we do it with 8 feet of sidewalk? But this, you've got a 14-story building. How do you kind of manage that? Again, you get into the programmatic needs of the building itself that the institutions are looking for, and you're trying to balance that with what you want on the public side.
So does jumping the highway alleviate some of that concern, or create new space or additional space? And then what does it do to Belknap?
It comes with a whole bundle of issues. I mean, it changes. One of the reasons we're doing this study is understanding just the way cars move. Traffic's like water. It'll take the path of least resistance. And as Michigan becomes more congested, it's going to go into the neighborhoods. Belknap's already felt that with Hastings, because the ramps, all the parking ramps go off of Coit, go off of Hastings. As it jumps into the neighborhood now, where it's all been residential, and again, that massing and scale of these large buildings, if you do a 4-story building next to a 2-story house, and the building's a block long, it completely starts to change that entire area. And the neighborhood actually went through a planning exercise last year that was adopted by the City Commission that identifies where they think future development would work in the neighborhood. So the neighbors have already started to weigh in on what they think is appropriate and what's not. But the challenge from our side of it, we have zoning to help regulate some of that. But the public institutions, especially Grand Valley, is exempt from zoning under state law. So they can do, if they wanted to, a lot of whatever they wanted. But they're very interested in being good partners.
All right, we'll have to end it there, but I don't think this is the end. I think there's going to be plenty more to discuss on this topic. Chris Knapp, Grand Rapids Press, thank you so much. Carol Valet, Grand Rapids Business Journal, Suzanne Schultz, City of Grand Rapids Planning Director, and Paul Spolstra will read this one. Medical Mile Resource Group, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this week. We'll see you next week on West Michigan Week.